All right, so new sermon series, Uncomfortable, Visions and Stories of Daniel. Daniel's a fascinating book. I kind of talked about that already, but it's really interesting, and it's about being faithful to God when things aren't going all that well for you. Like it's kind of being faithful to God when everything else is pushing you around, right? And Daniel begins in the Babylonian captivity, when Daniel and several of his friends are hauled off to exile in Babylon. So we got to remember, we got to do a quick little study to recap where we are at, right? Because here's the thing, I talked about this in Sunday school, and I think it was helpful. So it's good to remind ourselves of how the Bible works, all right? The Bible works. So we, as people in here, we generally, just as Americans, this is how we think. We think in like a linear form. There is an A and there is a B, and the stories we tell get us from A to B. We get to, a long, long time ago in a galaxy far, far away, right? To now they lived happily ever after. And that's kind of how we tell stories. The Bible doesn't work like that, all right? It just isn't like that. The Hebrews, the way they think, and a lot of ancients think this way, they circle. They circle back. And so as they're moving forward, they keep going back. As they're moving forward, they keep going back and back. And so they're reminding you of things that have happened before. All right, so when you're reading the Bible, I don't care where it is, in the New Testament, Old Testament, be looking for the callbacks. There's a theologian that I really like. His name is Tim Mackey, and he calls them hyperlinks. Like he calls them hyperlinks, where they're linking back to stuff that happened previously, and a bunch of that happens right here at the top of Daniel. It's inviting you to see that. So we need to set up those hyperlinks for you. So if you remember we got to remember how Israel ended up in exile. We don't have to call it exile. That's a kind word for what it is. Like we all kind of know what it is, right? When someone comes in and takes over your nation and drags you off to theirs and makes you work there, what's that called? Right? Exactly. Exile is a cleaned up word for what it is. All right? It's not a good time to be in exile. All right? And that's what they are. Okay? So they go out there. So let's do a quick little history lesson here. So the desire of God's people, and I think it's been our desire too, is to be like God, to know both good and bad. We want to be like God. We want to ascend ourselves to God. Because remember, with Adam and Eve, that's what the serpent said. He said, did God really say if you wouldn't eat this tree of the knowledge of good and evil, of good and bad, that you would die? Did he really say that? I don't think that's what he said. I think he said, as soon as you eat it, you would be like God. Right? And they're like, ooh, I could be wise like God. I can know good and bad like God. All I have to do is eat this, right? And they ate it, and they ended up falling out of paradise. Then we get to that big tower, right? They get to that big tower that they built. They're all building together, and they're trying to reach up to God, right? What was that tower called? Babel. Hold on. What? It was called the Tower of Babel? Where are they now? Where are they in exile to? Babel. Whoa. Wait a second. That sounds familiar. Babylon. I always thought like Babel was like blah, 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 like all that stuff, because the names are like, yeah, but it's Babel in Hebrew. It's the Tower of Babylon. And Babylon is trying to ascend itself to the very place of God, and they're building it together, and God dispersed them, right? And then we see they come out of Egypt. Remember, they were enslaved to Egypt. You're seeing a trend here, right? Remember how history keeps going back? And so they're enslaved to Egypt, and God rips them out of Egypt. God rips them out of Egypt, but rather than finding their true identity in God, they wanted to get more and more and more and be better and better and better. And they wanted to go back. There's this interesting interaction that happens after God takes them out of Egypt, after God takes them through the Red Sea, through the evilness of the sea on dry ground. After God has them go over, they're looking at the food that they're eating, and they're like, man, life was great back when we were slaves in Egypt. At least we had meat in our bowls, and now we have this, I don't know what this is, because they had manna, and manna means what is it? They're like, now we're eating I don't know what, right? Like, I don't know what this is, right? They start pining after going back to Egypt. They start pining after wanting, God has given them complete freedom, and they want to go back to slavery. Right? Because they're like, ooh, we had all this great food back then, right? Even Moses, he failed to trust in God at one point when he was so frustrated with what everything's going on that God told him to touch his rod touch his little staff, right? To the rock for water to come out. And he's like, no, bam! And he hits it hard and water comes out, And it's like even Moses is trying to do things bigger and better and all that stuff over there again. And one of the things that Moses said, what's going on? Oh, appreciate it. Brad's watching out for me. Because here's what would have happened. I would have looked down and went like, where is it at? So Moses, and right before the Israelites go into the promised land, right before they go into the promised land, this is the end of Deuteronomy. He looks at them and he gives them this huge sermon. It's at least 45 minutes long, right? Oh, I know, right? It's probably longer than that. But he gives them this huge sermon about how they live. And right in the middle of that sermon is encapsulated this stuff about don't go back to Egypt. Don't go back and desire the things of Egypt. And then it says, don't go back and get those Egyptian horses. Now, I know what you're thinking. You're like, Egyptian horses? Like, what's so special about Egyptian horses? Like, sure, they're nice and all that, but it doesn't just mean Egyptian horses. It means don't go after the power of Egypt. Don't go after the warfare might of Egypt, because those horses pulling those chariots was what separated Egypt in the Bronze Age from everybody else. Don't go after that might. You are God's people. Live as God's people. Don't go after them. And so they're living in the land, right? And God gave them judges to kind of rule over them, but there was this cry that kept on happening. What was that cry? We want a king. We want a king like what? Like what the other nations have? Hold on. Are they wanting to go back to Egypt? It's what it sounds like. Right? We want like what the other big nations have. They look awesome and they look big and strong and amazing, and we want to look big, strong, and amazing. We want a king. Right? We want a king. They wanted more and more and more, just like Adam, right? Just like Adam. And God gave them a king. He gave them Saul. That didn't work out so well. David was better, but then we get Solomon. And how was Solomon described? Solomon was good. He started off good, right? He's very wise. He was given wisdom. He was handsome. You'd have to be wise and handsome and very rich to have as many wives as he did, right? Like I'm sorry, but that's just the way things work, right? And so he's very wise and all of these things, and he looks great. He has all this stuff, but then he has a downfall, right? Do you guys remember what his downfall was? it's almost quotes out of what Moses said. It says that he went after Egyptian horses. It's almost like the author was like, you see it? You see it? You see, he's going after the might and the warfare and the awesomeness of these other nations. He's going after and wants to be that other nation himself. He wants to be them, right? He's not trusting in the Lord. And then it pivots and he makes all of these different things, all these different nations, and has all these wives, and they are his downfall. Which, by the way, that sounds like Adam and Eve just a little bit. Now, I'm not blaming you ladies for things. I'm just saying that the story rhymes with what's going on before it. That Adam, the wife gave him the fruit, right? That all of Solomon's wives gave him the fruit. And it was his downfall. All the power and the majesty of all these nations that came from him marrying all these wives ends up being his downfall. And we see the books of the Kings just as this struggle of them wanting more and more power and prestige. And when we get up to the exile, I was always thought when I was younger that the exile was, man, why would God allow them to go into exile like that? Why would God allow them to go back into slavery? Like, why? God's a loving God. Why would he allow it? Hopefully I've showed you now what actually is going on. They want it. And it's almost like God finally goes, listen, I've been holding back the gates. If you want to be like Babylon so bad, then fine, you can be part of it. First lesson of the day is be careful what you wish for. You just might get it. Right? Like you just might get it. If you got to watch out. Because you just might get it, right? Like that is the first lesson. That is the lesson of the exile. They wanted to be part of the biggest, baddest thing in the world, that no one was more powerful than them. And God goes, well, here you go. Now you are. And they go back into Babylon. That's where Daniel begins. That's where Daniel begins. Now, I want to show you some things. Show you some interesting things. So I've been setting this up, trying to get you over here. We're going to read a little bit about at the beginning of Daniel here. It's going to be verse 4, but the setup of it is the chief eunuch. The eunuchs were guys that were able to be close to the king because they weren't allowed to really mess with their queens at all right? That's why they have eunuchs in the courts. So the chief eunuch got some of the best from Israel, part of the royal family and nobility. Verse 4, youths without blemish, of good appearance and skillful in wisdom, endowed with knowledge and understanding and learning, and competent to stand in the king's palace, and to teach them the literature and the language of the Chaldeans. What does that sound like? There's some interesting language in here. Youths without blemish? It sounds like the lambs for sacrifice, doesn't it? Doesn't that kind of what that sounds like? No, it couldn't be anything that obvious, right? Like, yeah, it's the use without blood. That sure sounds like a sacrificial lamb that is perfect, of good appearance and skillful in wisdom. How was David described? Remember when Samuel went out to Jesse's farm and he was like, show me one of your sons, they're going to be king. And he showed him all the old ones and he's like, eh. And then he sees the youngest one in the field and he says, he's handsome in appearance. All the kings are kind of recognized as being like full of wisdom, right? Not to mention that Daniel and his friends, which we're going to meet here in a second, which, by the way, Judy, good job with the names. Isn't that fun when you're reading, you're like, oh my goodness, names. Like that. Yeah. That's like, good job. Here, I always say this, but this is how you got it. If you guys are up here reading and all of a sudden you see names, just do your best. Everyone here is rooting for you. No one knows how to pronounce it either. Like that, you just go, right? You just say whatever's in front of you. It's like, and then he had his friend Oatmeal, and just be consistent, Like so. And so they're looking good though. They have knowledge and understanding and learning, and they're competent. These are Hebrew royals. They are in the line of David. To put a Hebrew thing onto it, they are in the line of the Messiah, right? And they are as best as they can be. And Babylon has grabbed them, who's in this line. It's looking like they're perfect, right? That's key right there. Daniel and his buddies, they're perfect. And Babylon wants to rub their Babylonian selves all over them. They want to take them out of their Jewishness and make them appear like Babylonians. They want to do that, so the first thing they do is they make them eat. And the king assigned them a daily portion of food that the king ate and of the wine that he drank, and they were educated for 3 years and all of that. So this king's food, what is that king's food? I had never really thought about the king's food because we see later in the story that Judy read earlier that Daniel refuses to eat the food, right? And he eats vegetables instead. And I've heard some people say, well, we should just be vegetarians then. That's a hard life. That's harder than I can do, I think. No bacon. I'm not even all that big into bacon, but I am big into pulled pork sandwiches. And that's not like, you go to the barbecue house and there's not a whole lot of vegetables on that. Like you look at the side menu and it's like lamb shank baked beans and there's like pork in the beans, anyway. So what is this? It's not really about being vegetarian. It's what the king ate. Now, where did the best beef and pork, where did it go? It was sacrificed, right? It was sacrificed to their gods. The very best of it was. It was sacrificed there. And so when they would then take the best foods. I mean, this is like Kobe beef, right? This isn't the stuff that you go to Walmart and get that we can afford, This is the stuff that's good, right? That you actually have to go to the butcher for. That's the type of beef that they're talking about right there, right? And they are then feeding that to them. Think about that. They knew the one true God, and all of a sudden the only food that they're supplied with is food that was sacrificed to these other gods. That's the first time where they're trying to take their identity. They're trying to erode the image of God that is in them, right? And among these were Daniel, Hananiah, Mishael, Azariah of the tribe of Judah. Do you guys know these people? Yeah, you do. Yeah, I heard some people. That's Daniel, Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. Why in the world do we know them by those names? I think we know it because we know about the fiery furnace, which is next week, by the way. We get to talk about that. It's the fiery furnace, and we have a good time with them. But those are their Babylonian names. Those are their captivity names. There's other words you could say that, other ways you could say that, right? Those are their captivity names, and we know them by that. That bothered me after I studied this, by the way. That bothered me. And so they're over there, so they are given new names. They are given new names. But before we talk about these names, I want to talk about Daniel a little bit. Daniel, he's without spot, without blemish, and all this stuff, and he's trained to serve the king. And I think this is kind of where the first point is here. There's a question that's asked of Daniel here, and it's asked of us today. And that question is will Daniel be comfortable with his identity that God has made for him and uncomfortable in the culture around him? Or will he want something greater like all of his ancestors? Does he want to be something greater and be comfortable in the culture that is around him and be uncomfortable in his faith? And that's a question for us all. Are we seeking comfort in the culture that is around us, which will make us uncomfortable in the faith? Or are we seeking to be uncomfortable in the culture around us, but comfortable with God? Like that is a hard truth, and it's one that's sitting right up here at the top of Daniel. It's sitting right up here on the top. You know, are we secure in our identity of who God has made us, of how He's redeemed us in Christ? Are we always trying to get more, to be better, to be great, right? Are we always trying to do that? There's this temptation to always have more and more power, whether it be giving into the culture around us, you know, and trying to please all these people around us, or whether it being something as simple as criticizing someone else because we want to have power over them. What you did was dumb there, right? We criticize it because we feel better about ourselves when we're criticizing. Or are we like being like Solomon, going after those Egyptian armies, building bigger and bigger barns, trying to acquire more and more stuff? Or are we going after those Egyptian horses by making a stronger and stronger military might, right? Or are you secure in who God has made you to be now? With Daniel, we see that there is this eroding of who they are. They make them try to eat the sacrifice, but they also change their names. They changed Daniel's name from Daniel to Belshazzar. And you're like, okay, that's fine. Like Belshazzar, that's not a bad name. But what does this name mean? What does this name mean? Daniel means only God can judge me. I am judged by God alone, right? Belshazzar means I'm a servant, I'm a slave of the king. That's what his name means. Think about that. Going from only God can place me where I'm going to go, and they give him a name that's like, no, you are under the king. Think about, they changed his name, trying to erode who he is, right? That's, you will protect the king. That's what your name is. That's what your job is. And all of their names are that way. Like we have like Mishael and so you have Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. All those names, their Hebrew names were like names like, like God is glorious, God is holy, God is gracious, God lives through me, or how their names are. And the Babylonian names they give them are servants of, which one was it? I'm trying to remember. Servants of like Axio, which is their moon god. They name them all after their own gods. Think about that. You are good-looking Hebrew royalty, and Babylon takes you over, and they want you to eat food sacrificed to these other gods. And they want to change your name and call you, and every time you hear your name, you hear, I am a servant of this God. How would you react? How would you react in such a situation? There's kind of two ways, right? One is to be like, I can't win here, and you just completely like capitulate to it all. It's like, give me the pulled pork that was sacrificed to the moon god, right? Like that. And you just go ahead and eat it. And then the other way is like, no, and you fight, and you get out of there, right? And you'll probably die in the fight. Daniel doesn't do either one of those, which I think is really interesting because we see him living in this tension of who he is. He's living in the tension that the culture he is in exile. He is in exile to these people who want him to lose all notion of who he was before, for him to become Babylonian, right? And he refuses to lose it, yet he doesn't fight. He becomes a servant of the king. because he looks at the food sacrificed to idols and he's like, I can't do that. And so he appeals to the eunuch and he's like, hey, can we work out a deal? What if I just eat vegetables? Me and Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, we just eat vegetables. And the guy's like, if you do that, you're going to be scrawny. We can't have you look scrawny. We have to have you looking awesome because that's all that matters. And he goes, all right, 10 days. 10 days. If I look scrawny after 10 days, you can get rid of me. And he's like, and the eunuch's like, I'm a betting man and I like, to see violence. It doesn't say that in the text. I'm reading between the lines. And so he does that. And after 10 days, they look better than everyone else. And it says the Lord protected him. That is a faith that Daniel has that, man, I hope that I would have that same faith, right? I hope that I would, when someone is trying to demean me, to take me down, to say that I have no identity left in this God, that I could go, I'm still going to serve you, but I'm going to stand in my faith. Like because that's what Daniel does. He's in this tension, this uncomfortability of the world around him. He's in this uncomfortability, and yet he's still serving. And we're going to see next week that he ends up becoming like the second guy to the king. Because he felt like he had to serve those around him. He felt like he didn't have to become the biggest and the best around. He lowered himself to become a servant, right? He lowered himself. That's a message for us right there. That's a message for us. And we see this all through the New Testament too. The New Testament picks up on Daniel a ton. And we see this in 1 Peter. Because we ask ourselves like, well, so how do we deal with things now? Because we can watch the news, right? And we look out and we see leaders and people like that. We're gearing up for another presidential campaign. We're watching Babylon at its best right now, right? Like with the world around us in this country. We're watching this all around and we're looking at all of it. And we watch the news and it's easy for us to look at that and get enraged and zealous. And as Christians, we need to go, I'm not going to be mad about the name change, but I am going to serve you. I'm not going to eat the food. I'm not going to do something that affects you. I'm going to try to make you better in it. I'm going to live here. We see this in 1 Peter. 1 Peter, it says, oh, that's not 1 Peter. I've been skipping slides. Here it is. 1 Peter, it says, for this you have been called, because Christ also suffered for you, leaving you as an example, so that you might follow him in his steps. He committed no sin, neither was deceit found in his mouth. When he was reviled, he did not revile in return. When he suffered, he did not threaten, but continued entrusting himself to him who judges justly. He continued entrusting himself to, what was Daniel's name mean? God can judge me. He continues to trust himself to him who judges justly. Jesus did not, and you know why Peter is talking like that? He's talking about when the Roman authorities want to mistreat you. He says, be kind to them, because our Lord died on the cross, a Roman cross, and rose again. So what are you trying to do, Christians? Are you trying to be like those kings of old, they're trying to gain more and more power? Or are we like Daniel, that's trying to serve because Christ loves you and is with you? And it says this right afterwards. He himself bore our sins in his body on the tree, that we might die to sin and live in righteousness. Because by his wounds, you have been healed. This is what Daniel knows, that by God, he will see this through, and he will become a servant of all those around him. They may try to take him, they may try to take his image, they may try to take his life, they may try to do all these things, but Daniel will continue to serve his God and remember his image. So Christians, here as we close up, we live in a tension. We live in a tension, and it's uncomfortable. We live in a world, we live in a Babylon, right? We live around here, and it can feel like it's against us so often. And when we feel that, that means we're living in that tension. It means we're living there in that uncomfortable tension, and that's right where God wants us, because that's where he puts all of his servants, that we may bring light into every situation we go in. This is a cool book. It's really cool as we go forward into this, as we see what it looks like to live in this uncomfortable tension.